Bloody Mary, you have my child. When Joni awoke, it was 9:58. She looked over at her digital clock. She jumped up from her bed and ran out of her room, stopping at the bathroom. She opened the door and carefully edged for the light switch. She expected a cold, clammy hand to wrap around hers, then pull her in. She found the switch and flipped it. The bathroom was in tip-top shape. Everything was in the order her mother had put it in. She took out a bobby pin that would aid in her plan. She reached for the doorknob and locked it from the outside. The alarm clock setting on the counter turned to 10 o'clock. She had to hurry. She took the bobby pin out of the lock. Joni closed the door and headed for her room. But what seemed like 10 seconds after closing that door, she heard the cracking of glass and the small thump of footsteps on the linoleum. Once Joni reached the door to her bedroom, she looked back. The doorknob was rattling back and forth. She felt fear wash over her like a bucket of ice-cold water. She had to get out of the house, but found it was too late. A long, bony finger with a sharp yellow nail protruded from the keyhole and twisted sideways with a small click. The finger recoiled and the door started to open slowly. Joni ran into her room and slammed the door behind her. She put her back to it, eyes closed, praying soundlessly. Outside, she could hear the soft creaking of the carpet. It was corrupting. Joni could hardly breathe. She knew it was coming. She knew. Then the footsteps ceased. The doorknob shook, but Joni had the handle on it. There was a tenuous push on the door again, but Joni still had her broad shoulder propped up against it. This time the door was hit with strong force. That caused Joni to step back a bit, but that made her push harder against the door. It came again, only stronger. This time the door even opened, introducing a wicked, rotting odor. Joni pushed back, slamming the door. She started to cry, tears rolling down her cheeks. She needed something to prop up against it. She looked over to see her computer chair close to her flexing foot. She slid her foot under the bottom of it and dragged it closer. The door flung open again, but Joni just pushed back, closing it again. She grabbed the chair with her free hand and pushed it under the doorknob. She made sure it was secure before jumping back onto her bed, but the chair held the door in place. She looked over at her digital clock. It was 10:04. Just one more minute. She looked at the carpet. Blood, streamers of it, were seeping under the crack. The chair was rocking back and forth and blood was dripping out from the keyhole. Then the digital clock turned to 10:05. Joni looked back at the door, but there was no more movement. She could distinctly hear someone step into the bathroom. Then the door slammed, the lock clicking. She put her face into her hands. This was going to happen every night. But how could she keep doing this? She lay face down on her bed, struggling with a breath that threatened not to come. A week later, Joni snuck out of her house and went to the park. It was 9:39, and soon she would be visited again. Joni sat down in a swing, her head in her hands. 10:05. Mary checked her own watch, her arm shaking slightly. Nothing happened. Okay, I can go home now, Joni said shakily. They both got up and started to their homes. In the pure darkness, Mary could see Joni's pale white skin. It was milky, and it made Mary's skin tingle. It was like sharing the sidewalk with a ghost. Then Mary reached the street corner that would lead to her house, but Joni grabbed her arm. Mary wished she hadn't because the grasp was icy and felt like rubber. She hadn't cut her nails for a while, and they were digging into Mary's skin. Walk me to my house? She asked. Mary and Joni made their way to Joni's house, which was on the opposite corner. Mary looked over at her. She was literally quaking with cold mixed with fear. If Joni was telling the truth, she was truly in hell. Then sirens broke the awkward silence, followed by a plume of smoke that covered the sky. Then there were yells of desperate and frantic men. Joni and Mary exchanged worried looks before Joni took off in a stumbling sprint. Joni! Mary yelled, running after her, slippers flipping away from her feet. Rocks, bits of gravel, and what seemed like a rusty nail cut through her feet. Mary squinged in pain, but kept running until she was around the bend to see Joni's house at the end of the corner, or what was left of Joni's house. It was swallowed in flames, firemen trying their best to keep the inferno down. Joni was running toward the house, yelling frantically, but two firemen grabbed her by each arm and held her down. Joni fought back, tears flooding out of her open eyes. Mandy stepped into her freshly painted house, slipping off her backpack. I'm home, she called, but her mom was most likely working and her dad was probably out on an important meeting. She sat down on the couch, not bothering to do her homework. She was too preoccupied with all that was happening. Mandy turned on her TV and started to stare into it, getting lost. TV always helped her with things that troubled her. Also, Joni helped with those kinds of things, but Joni seemed like she needed a little help too. Mandy lunged for the phone, but then thought she wouldn't be at Mary's yet. She didn't even know where Mary lived. She huffed a sigh of disappointment. Mandy slouched into her chair, waiting for a phone call. Come on, Mary, don't keep me waiting like this, she thought to herself. Joni was her best friend of all these years. She did not believe in ghosts or any kind of supernatural things, but there was something about the way Joni was behaving the past few days. She had been through a lot. All of a sudden, a dark figure passed through the room, which made her screech out in horror. Joni was lying on the floor in front of her, with a knife driven into her head. Then the phone rang, and Mandy bolted out of her sleep. It was nighttime, and a blanket was wrapped around her. Mandy snatched the phone and set it to her ear. "Hello?" she said sourly into the phone. "Mandy, turn your clock to 10, Joni's voice said on the other side. "Why?" "So I can come to get you. All of you, especially Joni. You'll all fall into temptation." It was a woman's voice now. Then blood spurted out of the phone, drenching her. She burst up from her couch, sleep still on her, when she hit the ground. She then snapped her eyes open. It was just a dream. She was on the floor, breathing hard. Just a dream. The clock on the wall said it was 5:42. So she had been sleeping for some time. Her parents still weren't home, but she wasn't worried about that. They usually came home around 6. Still, Mary hadn't even called, and Mandy was worried about that. Mandy went into the kitchen to find the butcher knife lying neatly on the kitchen counter. That hadn't been like that a few hours ago, or had it? Mandy walked quickly out of the kitchen and slowly went into the bathroom. She ran the water, cupping her hands, and she caught a pool of it to slosh on her face. Then she leaned over the sink. She looked up to see her crisp reflection in the wall-high mirror. She wiped her face and fixed her hair in front of it. She went to leave when something made her stop and look back into the mirror. She remembered Joni's party, where Joni had said the chant in front of the mirror. "No, no Bloody Mary," she said, smiling. Mandy frowned. She touched the mirror thoughtfully. She then closed the door and locked it. Mandy put her finger to the light switch for a second, still looking at her shuddering reflection. Then the bathroom went black. Mandy stared blindly into the darkness, trying to calm down. She let out a little frightened squeak before reciting the chant. When she was finished, she added, "Bloody Mary, I have your child." By then she was bolder and sure that she was safe. Darkness, silence. Nothing was happening. She let out a low, relieved sigh before reaching for the light switch. Crack, crack. Mandy's hand stopped in midair, her head pounding. The mirror was cracking. Mandy leapt for the door, but she couldn't go any farther than a slight shuffle. She started to panic. Then Mandy froze, eyes fixed on the darkened mirror. A blue woman, dressed in a long robe, stood behind a slightly illuminated Mandy. The woman was covered in pouring blood. Her eyes were white, and her mouth was twisted in a horrid frown. Mandy started to moan as a hand rose up and rested on her shoulder. Nails sunk down into her skin. Then she was thrust backward, and she was slashed across the spine with a long bladed cane. Mandy's body writhed back and forth as she was slashed and stabbed. Mandy was still screaming until the butt of the cane came down into her mouth, knocking out all her front teeth. The glowing woman frowned throughout the whole process, eyes never leaving Mandy. The blade of the scepter was thrust into Mandy's intestines, causing a streamer of blood to squirt across the bathroom wall. Mandy then was thrust forward, face first into the floor, smashing the top of her skull, and then Bloody Mary picked the semi-dead Mandy up by the collar and dropped her backward onto the bathroom counter. Her head smashed into the mirror, finishing her off. Her eyes rolled back and her head lolled to the side. Then Bloody Mary was simply gone, leaving a blood-stained bathroom and a bleeding corpse to go with it. All this happened in 30 seconds. Then the phone started to ring and ring until it got the voicemail. "Hi, Mandy, I guess I called at the wrong time. Joni's okay, she's right here. We had a bit of a scare, but no big deal. Okay, I'll call back. Bye," said Mary. Right at that very second, Mandy's parents walked in the house together. "Well, she didn't pick up," Mary said, turning towards Joni, who was curled up in Mary's bed. They were both in Mary's room, both counting down to 10 o'clock. Mary was sitting at her desk right in front of a huge mirror. Joni was looking at the mirror, watching her reflection, her withering, dying one. "Joni, did you hurt yourself when you fainted?" Mary asked worriedly. "No," Joni said. "My dad's really worried," Mary said. "Lose the mirror," Joni replied. "What?" "I can't sleep in this room. It has a mirror." Mary looked back at it. She could see Joni shuddering in the glass. She was convinced that Bloody Mary was tearing her world apart. "Well, when our guest room's ready, you can sleep down there," Mary replied, looking back over at Joni. 4 more hours, Joni said, ignoring Mary completely. Mary sat back, secretly wanting Bloody Mary to take her away from all this complication, yet Joni too was wishing the same thing. Mary left to go to the bathroom, and when she got back to the room, she turned the knob savagely. Locked. Mary twisted the knob again. "Joni, come on, let me in," Mary yelled. No response. Mary slammed against the door, yelling for Joni to open. "Is everything okay?" Mr. Jacobs yelled up at Mary. "Yes, fine," Mary lied. Mary turned back to the door and bent down to look through the keyhole. Mary gasped. The room was in a mess. Joni was against the opposite wall of the mirror, writhing around like she was being slapped. The mirror was pouring down blood, flooding a river of red over Mary's white carpet. Mary extracted a pin from her hair and stuck it into the lock. She turned and spun it around until she heard a click. She swung open the door and gasped again. Joni was lying in the corner, shivering fiercely. The room was in perfect order, and the mirror was back to its clean self. The carpet was no longer blood-stained. Mary, she somehow got through the mirror. She will kill me if I sleep in here," Joni stuttered. I just saw this room and you being torn apart. What do you mean? Mary said, running towards Joni to help. She came out. She would have killed me. Her eyes, Joni sobbed. Mary led Joni out of the room, trying to ignore the freezing temperature. Mary and Joni sat down in her sister Katie's room to talk, but Joni just rolled over to her side. Mary got up and put a blanket around Joni's shoulders. But her friend didn't close her eyes, not even to blink. Mary passed her room but closed the door, still thinking of the room she saw through the keyhole. She didn't even think she could sleep in it anymore. She didn't want to leave Joni alone, so she went into the computer room right next to Katie's room. She turned on the computer to play some solitaire. She couldn't stop thinking of Mandy and the way she looked at Mary before she walked home. Mary had even promised to Mandy she would call her. Mary thought that maybe if she had called just a few minutes earlier, Mandy might still be alive. Mary leaned back in her chair. In the room alone, Joni spoke to herself. It's the reflection in the mirror. It's the blood on the glass. Joni's body twitched suddenly from Katie's bedroom floor, foam starting to drop from her chin. 9 o'clock, Joni said, right as the clock in Katie's room turned to 9. That night, Mary fell asleep in the computer room, and Joni was absent from Katie's bedroom floor. Come to think of it, Mary's father didn't even think twice as to why Joni spent every night locked in the basement from 10 to waking hours. He was a little worried why he would find a new crack in the bathroom mirror each night. Mary herself was sleeping down on the couch instead of her room all that week. She kept thinking of what Joni had said about Bloody Mary in her bedroom mirror. Mary's father was worried of that as well. Joni, though, slept down in the basement, the door locked. Sleep was not the right word, though. She would just huddle in the corner, eyes wide and glassy. When she rarely did fall asleep, she would dream of Mandy being thrown into a shattering mirror by a blood-stained arm. Joni would then wake up in a cold sweat, only to get up to get ready for another day, even if it was 1 o'clock in the morning. Then Mary would wake up to her alarm clock to find a pale Joni, dressed in her regular clothes and backpack, staring down at her. Good morning, Mary, Joni would say coolly every morning. Ready for the day to come? The next 2 weeks were horrible for Mary and Joni. Night after night, as Mary slept on the couch, she could feel a cold draft pass by her huddled figure. She would always wrap her blanket over her head and try not to breathe hard. Mary would even hear footsteps pass right by the couch and down the hall. This would always happen at 10 o'clock. Mary would then listen intently as the basement door down the hall rattled and banged around. This is, of course, where Joni slept each night. The door would just keep rattling silently at first, and then to a point where Mary thought her family would wake up. They never did, though. Some nights, Mary just wanted to jump up and run, but she had no idea of what the outcome would be. Right when Mary thought she was about to go mad, the rattling would stop and the cold breeze rushed by again. Sometimes Mary would hear the patter of blood on the carpet or the heavy wheezing of something. It was always 10:05. When Mary finally did wake up from her horrific nightmares, she would find no blood on the carpet, but there would always be a pale Joni waiting for her. The girls weren't doing so well either. They were all mourning the death of Mandy. They couldn't understand how Joni showed no emotion or compassion for Mandy. Joni would just sit silently in class, staring at the blackboard and whispering under her breath. The girls were also worried for Mary because, just like Joni, she wasn't getting too much sleep and was becoming incredibly silent. Mary was also falling asleep a lot during class, which always led her straight to the principal's office. Her father was disappointed and worried. Mary was usually such a good girl, but she had been going through a lot, yet he really didn't have any idea. Bloody Mary, I am your child. Joni crouched down low to the curb, not opening her eyes. She didn't hear any more laughing, but there was far-away crackling that seemed to start in the pit of her ears. Then it stopped altogether, making Joni relax a bit. She summoned up the remaining shred of her courage and snapped open her eyes in one swift motion. Nothing. The street was empty and she was on the sidewalk. She lifted up her aching body and managed to get to her bloody, bruised feet. The hammer she had dropped was lying in the middle of the street. Joni whimpered, questioning if it was okay to move from her spot. She decided and quickly limped into the street and snatched up her one source of protection. She shuddered and crossed her arms as a cold breeze lifted and came down across the street. Joni started to get scared, so she began to return to the curb. Then the breeze twisted and twirled around her in one soulless wisp. 2 clear red eyes appeared in front of her, not wielding any kind of facial appearance. Just 2 thin staring eyes only constructed out of the blowing wind. The eyes seemed to smile at Joni as if mocking her, drowning her in remorse. Then the laughing started again. The fierce, evil laughter of a woman. It seemed to come from the eyes, as if the black pupils were gaping mouths, reacting to some sick joke. Joni staggered backwards, arms twirling outwards for balance. The eyes seemed to follow her, though, with every step. Joni knew exactly whose eyes they were, Bloody Mary's. Somehow Bloody Mary was actually there, in no reliable form in front of her. This, Joni knew, was not her mental mind constructing this. Bloody Mary was actually there. She had the same feeling of dread on that day in Mary's room in front of her mirror. Joni screamed, falling backwards. The eyes closed, into nothing, and the ravenous wind blew off into the mini tornado, leaving Joni lying in the middle of the street. Her chest heaved and her head was spinning. She's getting stronger, Joni thought. The mirror. Mary's mirror is her transportation. She's getting stronger because of that. The mirror. Let's get back to Black Spruce, Joni proclaimed, getting back to her feet. Must warn Mary. Then sirens blew through the air like an elephant's roar. Joni stopped dead in her tracks as patrol cars lined the street and halted at Joni's feet. Police got out and aimed their handguns carefully at the delirious young girl. Joni, put down your weapon and step towards me, a broad cop said as he slowly approached Joni. His gun was in the holster, and that gave Joni the idea that no force was going to be used. Joni dropped the murder weapon. So be it. Joni stepped into the man's arms, and handcuffs were casually slapped onto her wrists. The clock struck 9:41. Joni wrapped her white, bony fingers around the cold steel bars of the jail door. She had been brought down to the Glenwood Springs police station, where there was a lone jail cell to keep intoxicated men for the night. But tonight it was to keep a 17-year-old girl. The deputy was sitting behind his assigned desk, feet kicked up, old western leather boots on, and a coffee mug sitting atop a stack of old worthless forms. He looked straight at the girl with interest. A 17-year-old girl, killing her own friend brutally with a hammer? It just didn't seem probable, but it did happen. And that's when Barry's job became an illness. It just made him upset to think about all the evil and loony people there were out there. Sir, what time is it? Joni asked, worriedly, shivering under the blanket that had been provided her. Girl, please, go to sleep. When you wake up, we'll decide then what to do with you, Barry replied, leaning back his head and closing his eyelids. Please, then I'll sleep. Barry grunted and raised his meaty arm like it was a back-breaking chore. He gazed at his watch intently and then turned his attention back to Joni. It's 9:56. Now go to bed. He relaxed again into his chair. Joni stepped back and then racked her brain for some kind of escape plan, but no such plan could ever be constructed. She gave up on that and looked at the wall above Barry's head. A small mirror in the shape of an oval hung from the wall. It was used by police who were around the corner so they could look at the mirror and see the reflection of the cell. It was much easier than completely turning the corner. If there was only some way to smash the glass, but that wasn't a possible plan either. So then she started to plead, beg for her escape. Please, sir, you've got to let me out. If you don't, you could really get hurt, Joni said desperately. Shut up, Barry yelled without opening his eyes. Please, you have to, Joni screamed, banging her fists on the bars. Don't make me drug you, girl, Barry said. Joni fell back into her spring-loaded cot. She hung her head and waited for the time to come. Barry's watch struck 10 o'clock, and immediately a wide crack slashed across the mirror. Barry jumped up from his chair and turned his head towards the mirror, which was now dripping blood. Joni was staring too, and she skirted to the very edge of the bed, her back resting on the concrete wall. What the? Barry asked fearfully. Then, long, razor-sharp nails dug into his shoulder and pulled him back onto the desk, scattering the paperwork and the full mug of coffee. He looked up and then screamed. A blood-stained woman with a blue flowing gown stood before him. He pulled out his gun with no hesitation, but Bloody Mary was quicker. The blade of her mother's scepter came through the air like a boomerang and separated a piece of Barry's stomach from his waist. Joni screamed, fingers digging into the wall until her fingernails popped right off her fingers in a string of blood. Bloody Mary turned her head towards the cowering Joni with her blank white eyes. Her torn purple lips peeled into a breathless smile, revealing black, molding teeth. She laughed quickly, letting black blood drip off her gaping hole of a mouth. Bloody Mary snatched the keys to the cell off the hook without even looking at them. She stopped at the cell door and jammed the key into the keyhole. Joni stopped screaming now, but terror was still scraping at the walls of her heart. The woman passed through the cell doors and smiled happily down upon Joni. I've waited a long time for this, Bloody Mary began, but her dead, dreary voice kept trailing off and coming back into focus again. Joni cocked her head upwards as Bloody Mary's bleeding hands brought up the cobra-shaped scepter. The long double-edged blade at the end gleamed red as it dropped slowly downward. Joni had time to see her whole life pass before her eyes and to say her last words. So be it. Then the blade sunk down into Joni's gut. She screamed, blood and intestinal pieces spilled out of her mouth. She let out a long, painful sob before her eyes rolled away and her head fell back onto the wall. Mary slowly backed away, and she quickly faded into the air with a rush of ice-cool wind. The mirror fell off the wall and shattered onto the floor in a cloud of blood and glass. The funeral was scheduled 2 days from the horrid night, where 4 people, Mary knew, had died. Nancy, Nancy's mom, Mandy, and Joni. Joni was to have her funeral first. Everyone was going to be there, including Mary and the rest of the girls. The funeral would have probably been the next day, but police were investigating both Joni and Barry's body, looking for some clue. Everything was inconclusive, though. It was the next day, and it was around 12 o'clock. School had been canceled for the day of the funeral due to the incident, and Mary was presently lying on the couch, her new bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Her family had cleared out, giving her some space. Julie had tried calling Mary's house all day, leaving sad, pouty messages. She wanted Mary desperately to call and talk to her, but Mary was coping with the deaths her own way, crying her eyes out and blaming herself. Within an hour, she was just lying on the couch, staring soullessly into the TV. All she could think about was Joni, dead, a huge hole in her guts. Even the policeman was brutally cut in half. Soon Mary even switched off the TV, because that's all she was seeing on the news. Woman and daughter found bludgeoned with hammer and death of teenager accuser in Glenwood Springs deputy. Mary slowly slipped into depression, all messages ignored until they just stopped. Mary couldn't even get up from the couch for lunch when Mr. Jacobs called her. Mary turned over onto her side and pulled the blanket all the way over her head. There was a loud buzzing noise in her ear, like the vibrating of glass. Mary fell onto the floor, glass lodging itself into her arms, which seemed to be already cut and bleeding. With a quick spin, she was up on her feet again, and behind her was the decapitated police officer. He was smiling and pointing at her, his body hanging from a noose, looped around his broken neck. His legs were lying on the floor until they jumped up and kicked squarely at Mary's shins. Mary pushed the legs away with bloody, long-nailed hands to face the deputy. The deputy screamed and pulled out a small make-up mirror. On the surface was the name Jacobs, smeared in blood. The mirror split in half, and so did the deputy, and he shattered when he hit the floor. Mary was flung backwards until she was standing in a dark, long hallway. All along the hallway were individual mirrors hanging on the walls. Each one had a different name on it, the person's head hanging right above it. Mary continued, feeling sick to her stomach, until she reached a mirror with the blood-written name, Mandy, on it. Mandy's head looked down on her, gapingly, eyes twitching. The next mirror said Nancy, and Nancy's face looked the same way it did the night she died. Mary screamed, running, until Joni's head mirror hung above her. Only Joni was wordlessly warning Mary about something. Mary turned and ran, until she saw a mirror up ahead, with the name Mary Jacobs on it. A nail hung above it, vacant and welcoming. Mary sprinted away, stopping at the feet of a little girl, holding the snake scepter. The girl was crying and calling out to Mary, to comfort her. Mary went to help her, but the girl disappeared into nothing. Mary crept away, sweat drenching down her forehead. The line of mirrors stopped a few yards away, and Mary was incredibly relieved. The hallway crept on, though, and a wall-length mirror appeared in front of Mary, and she smashed right into it. She did not feel the kind of pain she was supposed to, but she was certainly bewildered. She shook it off and squinted into the mirror. She screamed, hands wrapping themselves around her eyes. Her reflection was not hers. It was none other than Bloody Mary depicted on the glass. It was her, down to the blonde hair, blank eyes, purple lips, blue robe, and the deep cuts running across her skin like a road map. Mary opened up her eyes again, and she didn't see any kind of mirror anywhere. The hallway was plain and ordinary, no mirrors to be seen. Mary wanted desperately to leave, to get the hell out of there. She looked around one more time before sprinting down the winding dark hallway. It seemed to stretch on for miles, hours, days, until a dead end came up out of the black like the wall mirror that seemed to float in air. Mary stopped this time and desperately pawed at the wall, and crying for it to grow a door, some kind of exit. No such luck. Mary put her back to the wall and looked back at the other way, and she shuddered. She couldn't go back that way. It was not going to happen. She took a deep breath and turned back to the blockade to see if there was now a door or even a window. There was none of that, but now there was a mirror. The mirror split right down the middle and squirted blood at Mary like a water spigot. She screamed as the hallway was filled with red. Mary was swept up into the roaring flood. Mary's name was slowly spoken over the pastor's microphone, along with Jennifer's, Laura's, Julie's, and Wendy's. Mary, who was currently sweating like a pig and lost in thought, bolted up from her pew. Wendy and the other girls were now standing up beside the Reverend. "Is Mary Jacobs here?" Pastor Alderbell asked. Mary's father pointed up at the altar and mouthed, "Go." Mary nervously got to her feet and strode up to the altar. She got into the small line behind the pastor. Laura turned to her and smiled. "Do you know what's going on?" she asked, sweat dripping off her black strands of hair. "I'm just as lost as you," Mary whispered, giving Julie a small smile. Julie did not return it. "Now, Mandy's, Joni's, and our dear Nancy's good friends will share a few words in respect." The Reverend wrapped his arm across Julie's back and pulled her up to the pulpit. "Julie?" Julie sniffed uncomfortably, her red, teary eyes glimmering in the candlelight. She cleared her creaky, phlegmy throat quickly. "Wow, I'm lost for words. It's been a very hard few months, I must admit," Julie whispered into the pastor's microphone. "I can remember the times we shared, like when we all went down to the Greenbelt when we were 7. We fell into a sticky swamp and ran away to the park because we were afraid of our punishments. We weren't found until 2 hours later. We got quite a talking to." Many parents chuckled into their handkerchiefs, including the girls up on the altar. Mary looked around with a slight smirk on her face until her eyes rested upon Joni's coffin, sitting a few yards away from where she stood. Mary gasped silently as Julie continued reminiscing into her childhood memories, untouched for perhaps years. No one noticed Mary step back, her eyes wide. No one noticed her mouth hanging open with a thin layer of spittle. Joni was sitting up in her coffin, her silk dress ruffled and pasted against her pale, cracked skin. Her head was directed at the frightened Mary. One eye was pointed at Julie and one at Mary. They were fixed and bloodshot, the color of milk. Her mouth was pulled back into a scared frown, her blue lips trembling. Mary turned to the congregation, but there was no realization of Joni's awakening. The vision was directed at Mary only. But why? Joni was now sitting at the edge of her coffin, her lifeless legs swinging back and forth dreadfully. Joni's face looked like a puzzle of complete gruesome displeasure and anger all at once. She spoke. "Mary, listen now!" The shaky voice, which didn't sound like Joni's at all, made Mary jump. "Your mirror, Mary, your mirror!" Joni whispered now, her eyes rolling back and forth like two tumbling dice. "Your mirror! Do away with it, Mary! Lock it up! Listen!" "What about my mirror?" Mary whispered, making Jennifer turn towards her. Mary did not notice. "Mary, listen!" Joni repeated, her words not quite matching her caterpillar lips. "I am," Mary responded. Jennifer frowned and pointed at Mary after tapping Laura on the shoulder. "Our treehouse has long since crumbled, our dreams long since forgotten," Julie continued in the background. "Mary, listen!" Joni screamed, her lips parting backwards, blood coursing out of her cheeks. "I am!" Mary screamed, the whole church turning toward her, their mouths gaping. "No! Listen!" Joni screeched, pointing a greenish finger up at the church's stained glass window, which had a long, gnarly crack spread across it. It ran straight down the cross's picture. Now that Mary was listening, she could hear the crack slowly spreading. "Mary, are you—" the pastor began, but Mary certainly wasn't listening. Nonetheless, Mary could hear evil laughter, and it was the voices of Mandy's, Joni's, Nancy's, Laura's, Julie's, Jennifer's, and Wendy's, all spliced together into one, which made Mary burst into tears and Joni into a fitful combination of screams. Joni's corpse turned a grotesque, bloated blue color. Her eyes popped like balloons full of sauerkraut, and her head rolled away like a 20-pound bowling ball, rolling toward the end of the lane. Her body collapsed into the coffin in a dead clump, her legs twisting into an unnatural ball before disappearing into the casket. Mary fell to the carpeted altar, her head spinning, her body twisting. All she saw were twirls of blurry people springing towards her, helping her up, slapping her face. Mary did not fall into sleep, but into a cold trance, one of such velocity and dread that no words could describe it. But she wasn't alone. Bloody Mary, I have your child. That crisp December 5th saw a slight turn in the weather. Icicles were melting and the snowmen were sinking. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and kids were home from school, and parents were plopping down in their sofas and chairs. The police weren't relaxing, though, especially not Officer Robert Downs and Donald Lawrence. They had been to the Jacobs household the previous week to see about asking questions about the disturbance at Penny Lane with the vandalized fence. The father, Mr. Jacobs, informed the officers that Mary and Caitlin Jacobs had been asleep the whole time. The two police thanked the man for his time and continued on their way. The next morning they returned to the blue log circle off of Penny Lane and took another look at what was left behind in Miss Delores' front and back lawns. Robert Downs dragged his foot through the fresh snow of last night. He paused. The sleeve of a jacket was sticking out of the white powder. He considered it for a moment as he carefully lifted it out of the snow. It was a heavy ski jacket. He brushed it softly and inspected his find. "Don, come here for a sec," he said to his partner. "Take a look at this." He handed Don the jacket and he looked at it with interest. "There's a rip in this jacket, almost as if it's been stabbed," Robert finished. "So what does this mean?" Donald asked, holding the jacket outwards. Robert did not answer. Donald turned the coat over and looked into the inner lining. On the tag was scribbled, "Mary Jacobs." Don's mouth fell open and he pointed this out to Robert. Rob took it and held it out in front of him. He peered down the street where he could just see the Jacobs house inside the cul-de-sac. "Well, let's get our facts straight," said Robert. Not long after this, the two policemen were on the porch of the house. No answer. The family was away. When the two men were about to turn away, the front door opened. They stood there for a few seconds waiting for someone to come out from behind the door and greet them, but no one did. "Hello?" Rob asked. He stepped forward, pushing the door open a bit more. The inside of the house was revealed, empty and silent. Rob put his hand to his gun and gave Donald a look of alert caution. Donald nodded, his hand at his own hip. Robert stepped inside the house, his gun loosely held out in front of him. Donald followed. "Is anyone here?" Ronald asked. He knew no one was, though. But how could the front door just swing open like that? Rob took a look at the door and saw that it had been unlocked. Usually when people leave, they lock the front door. Sometimes owners forget, but Rob tried to think if he had heard the lock click before the door opened. Had he? He could have. His hearing wasn't as reliable as it used to be. Don, I'm not liking the look of this, Robert whispered over at him. Don gulped and carefully cocked his handgun. Any sign of foul play? He asked. Robert looked around the house quickly. No, he said simply. Then a cry of pure pain broke through the silence. It was the voice of a woman. It was the cry of despair and anguish. This person sounded as if she had been wounded, and it came from directly under their feet. The basement. The cry came again, followed by something that sounded like a piece of furniture toppling over. The cops sprinted forward, searching every door they came to. They found the basement door in a matter of seconds and were bounding down the stairs. Robert yelled for the woman. Don screamed for anyone else to put their hands up. Ma'am, are you okay? Hands above your head! Once they had entered the cold basement, they saw nothing but old boxes and one unused treadmill. There was no distressed woman or anything of that nature. There was, though, not more than a few yards away, an old trunk which looked like it belonged to a circus years ago to carry costumes and props. It was turned on its side and looked like it had rolled a few feet forwards. That must have been the large bang they had heard from upstairs. That's a huge chest, Don exclaimed. He lowered his gun. Robert snapped his head around, but did not see any sign of anybody. He did not lower his gun, though. He strode over to the trunk and prodded it with the toe of his shoe. The trunk was big enough to hold a person. Maybe that was the source of the disturbance. Can anyone hear me? Robert asked. Robert, you think there's someone in there? Don asked, astonished. That's exactly what I'm thinking. He kicked the trunk harder this time. That's when it rocked upwards and slammed Rob in the shins. He screamed out and fell on his back, the gun bouncing away. Donald sprang forward to help Robert, but the trunk twirled around like a top. The corner of its base caught Don in the backside of his thigh. He lost his footing and did the splits right there on the concrete. His knee smashed into it, and the muscle in his groin twisted into a knot. The trunk rear-ended Robert in the lower body before it bounded backwards again. Robert screamed again, reaching out for his partner. Donald got onto his hands and knees and had time to see what looked like a hand shoot out from the trunk's interior. But this hand did not break through. It went through it. It was translucent, too, and blurry. Another hand came into view, and what Donald thought was the beginnings of a head. It was hard to make out, but he could see two glazed eyes. No mouth, but there was more blood running down the lucid features. Robert got to his feet and hobbled over towards Don's resting place. Donald looked up, stunned, his hands compressed against his sore leg. His eyes were glued to the ghostly figure that was emerging from the trunk. Robert grabbed Donald by his arm and pulled him up against the solid concrete wall. The figure was now up out of the trunk and was standing next to it. Rob looked back at a woman who hovered above the ground, with no legs, no real clothing, but he could see her arms held out at her sides. The one thing that looked unmistakable and solid was a scepter of some kind, held in one of her hands. It was sculpted from gold to look like a serpent, with jewels and diamonds encrusted on the outside. She just stood there for a few seconds before, out of the open serpent's mouth, a long double-edged blade slid, which was already blood-stained and rusted. The thing laughed wickedly. Robert moved fast and snatched Don's gun from the ground. He knew that it was no good, but he fired once through the figure, making dust of the back wall. Robert was hysterical now. He was about to fire again, but the woman appeared at Rob's feet and detached his hands from his arms in one long sweep. Robert screamed and was thrust backwards into Donald, sending them both into a dusty heap on the ground. Blood covered them both as the ghost woman loomed over them, her cold eyes laughing and mocking. She struck and sank the blade into Robert's chest, killing him instantly. Donald screeched and pushed his partner off of him. He quickly got to his feet and darted up the stairs with much effort. He could hear a woman cry out with glee, and the tread of footsteps on the steps behind him. Don screamed as he stumbled forwards onto his chest and knees. Behind him, hard laughter followed his temporarily grounded body. He scrambled up the steps. He was panting desperately, his hands reaching out at the stairs. His arm muscles helped to pull up his dead weight towards the open doorway ahead. Donald's fingers were right at the landing of the upstairs when a cold hand came through his uniform and dug into the top of his back. He howled in pain as the hand recoiled, pulling Donald backwards. He twirled his arms around in circles, trying to catch his balance, but he was gone. He tumbled back down the splintered steps, his head cracking into the wall, shoulders separating under impact, and his arm and one of his wrists snapped like twigs. On his way down, he fell through the woman, and before he died, he felt ice-cold life and death crawl into his veins and organs. propped up against the last stair, and the bottom landing was the scepter, its blade setting perpendicular for Donald. He had enough time to see it sitting there, the snake's eyes laughing and egging him on. He stuck out his elbows and kicked off at the stairs. He soared over the last few steps, but as he landed next to the dead Robert at the bottom, in a puddle of blood, his foot caught the handle of the cane and it twirled upwards into the air. Donald groaned, his head trying to raise upwards. His whole world was spinning now, and he could see a blue wisp of a woman standing in the stairwell, cold, dead eyes staring directly at Don's twisted, aching body. His head fell back onto the concrete. That's when he saw the falling cane impale into his hip. He screamed again, closing his eyes tight. Tears rolled down his chubby cheeks. When he opened his eyes again, the woman's featureless face was millimeters away. All he could see were her blank eyes, full of pain and hate. They seemed to scream out at him, cursing and mocking him. All of these mixed emotions rang inside his head after staring into those eyes. He spasmed forcefully with a serious heart attack. He twisted into a frozen knot, his eyes glassy and perplexed. His mouth was sculpted in mid-scream, his arms out in front of him, fingers gnarled. The woman simply evaporated into the air. Mrs. Norris peered outside her window around 5 o'clock to see a police car moving slowly down the road. Inside, a policeman, whose mouth and eyes were open widely, glared out of the window with a pained expression. He did not blink or move. It was like he was frozen. In the driver's seat, there was an officer who was hunched forward, his eyes closed and his hands missing from the wheel. This was very odd, but the car was driving, so there couldn't be too much wrong. Maybe he was searching blindly for something on the ground. He'd get his hands back on the wheel soon. She went away from the window, and she did not see the police car ride smoothly off the small, cracked road and onto the lake beach. It rode smoothly across the sand, past houses' backyards until it slowly drove into the lake. It treaded water until it was about 10 yards out. It sank downwards in a small spray of foam, leaving only a few bubbles to decorate the water's surface. If Mrs. Norris had checked the lake, she would have seen the Buick sitting at the bottom, quickly gathering rust. Inside, 2 dead bodies hovered loosely above their seats. One would have missing hands. If Mrs. Norris had looked out of her window again, she would have seen a blurry sequined woman emerge slowly out of the water. Once on the beach, she would just fade away, taking the tire treads in the sand with her. But she left her footprints behind, which one neighbor noticed and pondered over. They were from the lake and seemed to vanish. She didn't seem to think much about it. From the school to Mary's house was a total of 17 minutes, so the bike ride wasn't very comfortable, due to the amount of seating each person had. Mary shuddered when she looked up at her house, because it was like looking at the face of an ugly mask. "Come on," Mary said, getting off the bike and proceeding into the house. Will and her sister Katie followed, both confused and scared. Katie at least knew what Mary was planning to do, but Will was left in the dark about the whole thing. Mary strode up the stairs, headed straight toward the open door of her bedroom. Will followed close behind, Katie in the rear. Mary took a deep cleansing breath and poked her head inside the room. She gasped and pulled back out into the hall beside her boyfriend. "It's back on the wall, even after I locked it up," Mary whispered to Katie. At that, Katie began to shake. "Get the hammer. I left it in the basement, by the trunk." Katie nodded and took off down the stairs. Will looked over into Mary's face. "What's on your wall?" Will asked. "Are you talking about that creepy trunk in your basement? Did your family finally get it open?" Mary didn't answer. She proceeded back into her room and noticed how freezing cold it was. A huge plume of her breath burst out in front of her. She covered her arms and sat down on her bed, facing the horrid mirror. "It's freezing in here," Will pointed out as he stepped inside the room. Katie stepped inside after him, the hammer held out like a baton. She also commented on the room's temperature before handing the hammer over to her sister. Mary lifted the hammer and stepped toward the mirror slowly. "Mary, what are you—" She moaned as the mirror fogged over, as if 10 people had just breathed on the surface, all at once, which caused Will and Katie to cower by the door. The mirror then started to hum and vibrate. On the glass, the darkness broke apart and revealed Will's reflection standing there in Mary's room, staring distantly at Mary. The mirror version of Will suddenly screamed as a long, rusty blade came into view and sliced down his forehead to his neck. He screeched as blood flew every which way, one of his eyes popping out of his socket. Blood now was starting to spray at the glass, splattering Mary's carpet and jeans. She screamed hoarsely, wiping blood away from her, but it only existed in the mirror. Will slid down the wall, leaving a streak of fresh blood. Now Katie came into frame. The same blades stabbed at her and caught her between the shoulder blades and reeled her backward. A blue hand reached out and grabbed her by the hair. The blade then came down in a shower of blood. Mary shook off the distractions. She got to her feet and raised the hammer. By the time the tool was descending towards the glass, her sister was flailing around on the floor, the blade stabbing into her stomach inside the mirror. Mary screamed her tonsils out as the hammer hit the glass and spread a large spiderweb crack across it. Off in the distance, they could hear a woman screaming out in pain. She brought the hammer back down into the mirror, breaking it off of the wall. She got down onto her hands and knees and made sure all of the large pieces had been reduced to gravel. The woman had stopped screaming, and by the time Mary brought the hammer down again, for the final time, they sat in silence. She dropped the tool and fell back onto her bed, tears rolling down her cheeks. Then Will flipped the light switch, and that's when everything came into perspective. The shards of glass were still there, and they noticed the large hole in the wall for the first time. The next day, after school, Mary did just as Miranda planned. She stayed behind to make up for a test she had missed, while Miranda and a couple of her friends broke away from the gym to roam the empty halls. Miranda circled around the history class several times, her hawk eyes plastered on the classroom door. "You remember your job, don't you?" Miranda asked her blonde friend. "I remember." Miranda smirked. She circled some more around the closed history room like a vulture as her friend prepped herself. The door swung open and Mary strode out. Katie had walked home so Mary could use her car. She pulled her keys from her tight jeans and proceeded down the hall. Outside it began to snow hard, which made Mary smile even more. She loved the snow because it only meant the holidays were closing in. From one of the classroom pods to Mary's right came the cheerleader blonde. She held a glass of red fruit punch in her hand. Mary didn't see the girl rush at her from the side and collide into her. The bright red punch catapulted at Mary's temple and soaked her face and hair in a sticky substance. Mary screeched and dropped her book bag. The blonde gave a sarcastic "sorry" and pulled back into the pod where her friends awaited her. "You're kidding me," Mary blurted, watching the cheerleader go. She shook off the liquid and started towards the restroom to clean herself off. When Mary disappeared behind the girls' room door, Miranda came out from her hiding place, ready to do her damage. Mary cupped her hands under the icy cooled water in the sink and did her best to cleanse the sticky mess off of her. She dried her face and tried to fix her hair, but soon gave up. She'd be heading home soon, so what did it matter? Miranda came in after her. Her thumbs twiddled at the end of her short cheerleader skirt. She whined helplessly, tossing back her hair with a click of her neck. Mary turned towards her and automatically gathered up her stuff, trying for the door. "Mary, please!" Miranda whined again, backing up against the restroom door. "What do you want, Miranda?" Mary prodded. "I have to talk to you. You know about Bloody Mary. Well, I did the chant thing last night and—" "Ha ha, Miranda, I get it," Mary said smugly. "I'm afraid of ghosts, right?" Mary tried one last time to push toward the door. "No, I don't joke this time. I did the chant, I saw her in the mirror, and I ran." Miranda started to fake cry, banging her forehead with her palms. "You're kidding. I don't know why I did it. I was just skeptical about the whole thing. I did it as a joke, but I know you were afraid of her, so I—" "Come on," Mary huffed. "All I did was say Bloody Mary 1, Bloody Mary 2, Miranda began. Bloody Mary 3, Bloody Mary 4. "Okay, Miranda, I know how it goes." Miranda slid the doorstop into the door jamb with the side of her sneaker. The other hand reached for the light switch behind her. "Bloody Mary 5, Bloody Mary 6, Bloody Mary 7. Mary wrenched away from her and looked into her own reflection in the restroom mirror, then back at Miranda, who was grinning ear to ear. She was no longer crying when she switched the lights off. "Bloody Mary 8. "Miranda, this isn't funny," Mary moaned, reaching around the sinks. "You don't know what you're doing." "Bloody Mary 9. "Don't!" Mary stumbled toward Miranda's outline in front of her, but caught her foot around the backpack strap. She fell forwards into the sink, but was able to catch herself. Bloody Mary 10, Miranda cackled. "Bloody Mary, I have your child." Mary screamed. Miranda gracefully circled around Mary until she was standing right next to the sink. "You baby!" Miranda threw back her head and laughed. "So where is she, huh?" Mary scrambled forwards and ran through the darkness, forgetting her stuff. She struck the door with her shoulder and turned the knob, but it was locked. How? Mary's foot kicked at the bottom of the door and found there was a doorstop wedged in the jamb. Mary fell to her knees and tried to unjam the doorstop. That's when Mary heard the distinct sound of cracking glass over her shoulders. Miranda stopped laughing, but Mary continued to try to dig the doorstop out from the crack. "What was that, Jacobs?" Miranda asked desperately. They heard dripping from the mirror, then running liquid, coursing down the wall-length mirror. It soon sounded like a fountain was in the room. Miranda screamed out in surprise as the dripping grew and grew until it sounded like they were in a waterfall. It started to cover the floor, and Mary could feel it pooling around her knees. Mary tried to dig the doorstop out, but her arm muscles felt knotted up, and her sweaty fingers slipped off the rubber item. She then started to cry along with Miranda. "What is this? What are you doing, Jacobs?" she moaned. The rushing water stopped. Silence consumed the two girls until something was wading through the liquid, stepping towards them from one of the stalls. Mary heard the stall door swing open and clack into the wall. Footsteps came closer and closer. "Is that you, Jacobs?" Miranda whispered in stone-cold fear. "No." Then Miranda screamed out for half a second before something sliced through the air, and something else that sounded like 10 pounds of meat plopped into the water. Mary spun around and almost fainted at what she saw. A blue woman held Miranda up into the air by her neck. Miranda thrashed around, but her mouth was stifled by the enormous amount of blood, so she couldn't scream. Her arm was laying next to the ghost woman's foot. Mary tried to shut her eyes, but couldn't. This was the first time she had seen Bloody Mary up close and personal. The woman had cold fishbowl eyes with milky white pupils. Her face was purple and pussy, her caterpillar lips pulled back to show yellow, rotting teeth. The cobra scepter Mary had seen in the mirror was sticking into the tiled floor. Miranda was thrown backwards into the bloody mirror, smashing it to thousands of glass shards, which scattered around Mary's huddled body. Bloody Mary once again picked up Miranda and set her neatly atop the sink. The scepter appeared in her hand. Her other bloated palm struck Miranda across the cheek, instantly waking the girl. Miranda choked, and even through the dark, Mary could see her look over at her with pleading eyes and a quivering lip. This only made the ghost woman smile even wider, as the bladed scepter connected with Miranda's gut. Mary tried to scream, but could only fall back into the door behind her, eyes glued to the glowing ghost, no more than 10 feet away. With the blade inside Miranda, Bloody Mary lifted the rag doll body up over her head and slung her backwards into the open stall. Inside, Mary heard the porcelain toilet reduced to rubble and the spray of fresh water. Mary turned back to her work and wrenched the doorstop out from the jamb with the remainder of her strength. She tossed it over her shoulder and turned for a moment so that she could get to her feet. She screamed because Bloody Mary's face was inches from her own. The decaying nose hissed like a squeaky squeeze toy as the ghost breathed. The rotten, rancid mouth was open before Mary, the pink tongue lifeless and useless. Her eye lolled back and forth as the other was rooted inside its socket. Blood ran down from it like tears. In a distant voice, which didn't seem to come from the moving mouth, Bloody Mary spoke to Mary. "I'll see you at home," Bloody Mary said simply. Mary wasn't going to wait for another second. She plowed through the door and through the empty halls. She sprinted through the fresh snow and fumbled with her keys. Once inside her car, she fell over the steering wheel and sobbed, her heart beating alarmingly fast. A soaking wet Mary tripped inside her house, her heart still beating, her hands shaking. She knew what the ghostly apparition had meant. She leapt up the stairs 3 at a time as the family came through the kitchen to welcome her. Had she really thought it was over? Mary stepped inside her bedroom, and her breath plumed out in front of her. She gasped, because there on her wall hung Bloody Mary's mirror, perfectly new and clean. She could see bloody footprints on the carpet leading back to Mary's bed from the mirror. On the bed was Mary's book bag, which she had left behind in the girls' room back at school. It was zipped up and nicely buckled. Katie followed Mary and stepped up next to her. She too gasped when she saw that the mirror was back. "Mary, the mirror," Katie began. "No, it's not just a mirror," Mary whispered. "Girls, is everything okay?" Mr. Jacobs called from the bottom of the stairs. The girls didn't answer.